an international public spokesperson for a global grassroots effort called 9/11 Pilot Whistleblower, whose purpose is to show that there were no Muslim hijackers at the controls of the 9/11 aircraft, but that the aircraft were electronically hijacked through employment of a system called the uninterruptible autopilot that enables a remote source to take complete control of the aircraft autopilot and flight management computers and fly the aircraft to its target. Once it's engaged, the pilots cannot disconnect the system. We've got a website for 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers at 911pilot.org and a YouTube channel at 9/11 Pilots. And if you want additional information on our organization or the systems I was just referring to, please go to those sources. As for myself, as a pilot, I commenced flying over 50 years ago in 1968, first as a civilian. I got my private commercial instrument and multi-engine rating by 1970. In 1973, I entered U.S. Naval Aviation, and over a course of 10 years, flew the P-3 Orion aircraft, which was a 4-engine turboprop used to track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. In 1978, I was hired as a pilot by United Airlines, and over the course of the next 25 years, I flew a total of 7 different aircraft. All totaled, I flew over 20,000 flight hours in 15 different aircraft. Now, having said that, I'll make a statement here that I always make. I can unequivocally state without reservation or embarrassment that I could not have possibly flown the 9/11 flight profile at those speeds and altitude, and neither could the hijackers. Now, I have today with me Captain Doug Greene, who's both a former military and airline pilot that has an extensive resume that's more expansive than mine is. And Doug, thanks for joining me on the interview.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could tell us what year you first commenced flying and the type of aircraft you flew over the course of your career and the position you held in each of those aircraft.
Sure. Actually, I started my aviation career about 40 years ago in the U.S. Air Force as an air traffic controller, and then I eventually worked for the Federal Aviation Administration as an en route center controller. And shortly thereafter, I started flight training in 1985 at the Edwards Air Force Base Aero Club, trying to accumulate some ratings, initially my private pilot's license. And then after which I found out opportunities in the military by way of the Air National Guard, and I went to Air Force pilot training. I was a distinguished graduate out of officers training. I was a distinguished graduate out of pilot training. I also, after pilot training, trained in the A-37, a light attack airplane, and also a forward air controlling airplane. Then transitioned to the C-130 Hercules. I flew that throughout the remainder of my military career. And contemporaneously, I began my career in the airline industry, accumulating time flying the Dassault Falcon fan jet, the Falcon 20, and the Learjet 23. And then I eventually, for a couple small companies in Michigan, and then I eventually transitioned to working for United Parcel Service. And I was a flight engineer on the DC-8, then a first officer. I became a first officer on the 747, 100, and 200, and then eventually I upgraded to captain in 2003 on the Boeing 757 and the 767. And then later I transitioned to the MD-11, and then eventually I went to Anchorage, Alaska, and I flew the 747-400. My most recent assignment, working for another company because of workplace violence and retaliation for being a whistleblower at UPS and attempts to enforce the safety and security of the airline. I was forced overseas, and I flew MD-11s out of Liège, Belgium for another company. And then I eventually, and currently on a leave of absence because of COVID-19, been flying the Boeing 777. I've accumulated approximately 17,000 hours total flight time. And I've been to Aircraft Accident Investigation School in the military, and I also was involved in the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program in the United States after 9/11 that showed some great resistance by the powers to be to implement that program. And that pretty much summarizes my flying background.
Wow. Well, you certainly would qualify as an expert pilot witness in under testifying under oath before a grand jury or in a federal court of law. In the future, if we move forward with legal action as we're planning, would you be willing to do either one of those things?
I would be. My only hope is that it would be a genuine process with honest adjudication. Because unfortunately, up to this date and time, I've been defending known fraud and perjured witness testimony as a result of being a whistleblower.
Okay. Let's move on to the flight that hit the Pentagon on 9/11, American Airlines Flight 77 that allegedly struck the Pentagon and was purportedly flown by Saudi Arabian hijacker Hani Hanjour. The profile itself, the airplane approached the Pentagon from the west and at 7,000 feet commenced a descending, accelerating 330-degree corkscrew turn to arrive at the surface without skidding the surface to precisely strike the Office of Naval Intelligence at over 500 knots, which is in excess of 500 miles per hour. Now, this maneuver was replicated in a simulator by some very experienced pilots, and almost without exception, every time they tried it, they crashed. Now, Hani Hanjour himself came to the United States in the mid-90s and did some flight training before going back to Saudi Arabia. And in January 2001, he returned to the States and tried to enroll in the same flight school, and they refused to accept him because he was such a poor student when he attended school there in the mid-90s. And believe this or not, in August 2001, a month before 9/11, he went to the Freeway Airport in Maryland, attempted to run a 172, and they refused to rent it to him because he could not handle the airplane or take off and land it. And yet we're expected to believe that this pilot managed to accomplish that amazing aerial feat on his first try. So having said that, without really having to get too much into the other two planes that struck the Twin Towers, do you believe that these inexperienced pilots could have flown those flight profiles? And if not, why not?
Well, I absolutely believe that it was utterly impossible for such inexperienced pilots to even imagine that they can transition from a simple airplane like a Cessna 172 that I also flew during my earlier years in training to a wide-body jet like a 757 or a 767. I've flown both of those aircraft. The aircraft systems are far too advanced for anybody with that kind of experience to hand fly or even use the autopilot system connected with LNAV and VNAV directly linked to the flight management computer. The flight management computer in the Boeing aircraft are very similar between the 757, 767, the 777 and the 747. It's very similar. And for a novice, an amateur with little to no training, that certainly isn't provided at a primary flight school, to actually program the flight management computer and to integrate it and couple up the autopilot and to know how to select LNAV, VNAV profile and to design that profile specifically to fly this terrible approach and crash into the Pentagon is impossible. And when you consider the maneuvering that was required, the maneuvering airspace that was required for a large jet of this nature, and you consider the cornering velocity, the high rates of speed, the radius of turn, this would be overwhelming for a pilot without any significant experience. Even a pilot with my experience, having flown light attack aircraft and having done aggressive maneuvers, it would be impossible for me. When you consider the high rates of speed that the aircraft traveled and that they actually exceeded their max structural limiting airspeed by 110 knots, the structure of the aircraft would have been compromised, especially from over-G'ing the airplane.
Right. Well, you just answered my next two questions because I was going to ask you if you could have flown them yourself, and you said no, and you've already discussed the difference between, say, a Cessna 172 and that of a modern commercial jet aircraft. So we know three airplanes struck three buildings on 9/11. We state that these pilots could not have flown the aircraft, and yet they precisely struck their targets that day. What reasonable alternative explanation could you have for how those aircraft were navigated?
Well, based not just from my expert opinion, but based on the actual facts and data, it's impossible for those individuals, the narrative that those individuals commenced this act of terrorism took place. In my opinion, based on some of the research that I've done and what I've learned about the uninterruptible autopilot and its inception long before 9/11 with Boeing and Honeywell, and also with the research that I've done into the actual findings at the crash sites from researchers like Niels Harrit and what appeared to be a controlled demolition versus an actual aircraft impact. If someone was so diabolic, which I believe there's motive that for this incident to have occurred that we can discuss at a later point in time, but I believe it was an act of domestic terrorism by our own government against the American people, and that they must have had used a remotely controlled device like the uninterruptible autopilot outside the flight deck.
Yes, well, I agree with you, and that is the assertion of 9/11 pilot whistleblowers. Now, about 99% of the global populace fell for the story that these poorly trained and inexperienced Muslim hijackers flew the airplane. Would you agree with me that the reason that they fell for this is because they're not pilots and cannot conceive of the absurdity of this notion that they flew the airplane because they know nothing about them?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. Most people that aren't experienced in aviation, um, uh, and because of the mainstream media, they believe the narrative, the line of sight narrative that's presented to them without questioning. But for people like you and I and other experienced airline pilots and people that have flown, fighter type aircraft, and we understand the maneuvering characteristics required to be able to pull off such a maneuver, it's almost an insult to our intelligence that this is possible. And it's our duty and our responsibility to inform the American people and the world this great American lie.
I agree. Um, we have that website at 911pilot.org, and if you go to that, if you're a pilot especially, we welcome the general public to join us as well. But we have a tab at the top of the page that says Join Us, and it's a very simple page to fill out. We just need your name, email address, and there's a box at the bottom that pilots can fill in what airplanes they flew and hours and all, such information as that, and we'll get in touch with you and invite you to participate in this process because there people don't realize that 9/11 was the worst crime ever committed on American soil in its history, and there's never been a criminal investigation into it. People believe that the 9/11 Commission was a criminal investigation. It was not. So with what we're doing with this information is we're going to be present it to lawyers in hopes that they will present it to a U.S. attorney in an effort to force a grand jury investigation into our assertions that these pilots didn't fly those airplanes. So uh, with that, do you have any closing comments you want to make, Doug?
The only closing comments I would have is this endeavor to try to finally have this crime investigated is very honorable on your part, and we thank you for your efforts and everything that you've gone through to get us to this point. My biggest concern is that if in fact this evidence was looked at and it was considered evidence beyond reasonable doubt that this indeed was a crime, which evidence beyond reasonable doubt is a criminal standard of evidence, that whoever the adjudicators are that they're men of integrity and honor, that have not been compromised, and that they will honestly adjudicate this case, because it has been my personal experience that our sacred institutions and all our regulatory agencies have been compromised from the top down. And so this is my hope.
Yes, mine as well, Doug. And I'll close out with that for now. Thank you very much for taking the time to be interviewed, Doug. And until next time, this is Captain Dan Hanley and Captain Doug Greene signing off and saying so long.